In the remote mountains of Montana, where cold winds sweep across empty wooden streets and sunlight cuts through abandoned doorways, lies a town that holds one of the darkest stories in the American West. This is Bannack, a place where gold built a booming frontier city, and fear destroyed it. In 1862, Bannack became the site of one of the richest gold discoveries in Montana Territory. Thousands of miners rushed into the valley, building cabins, saloons, stables, and shops in a matter of weeks. The town exploded almost overnight, loud, chaotic, and full of promise. But Bannack had a secret wearing a badge. Its sheriff, Henry Plummer, was respected, charming, and admired by many. But behind closed doors, behind the quiet conversations and the late-night meetings, Plummer led something far more dangerous. A ruthless outlaw gang known as the Innocents, responsible for robberies, ambushes, and murders. Stagecoaches were attacked. Travelers vanished. Bodies were found along remote trails. And all the while, the man sworn to protect the town was the one orchestrating the violence. For months, Bannack lived in the shadow of fear. A golden town controlled by a criminal empire. But when the truth finally surfaced, everything collapsed. The Vigilantes rose. Justice came swiftly, and Bannack's Boomtown dream was shattered forever. Today, the town stands frozen in time. Weathered wooden buildings, a silent gallows hill, and the echoes of a town ruled by the wrong man. This is the story of Bannack, Montana, the gold town governed by an outlaw sheriff, and the fear that led to its downfall. The gold strike that created Bannack. The story of Bannack begins with one moment, a single discovery that changed the entire Montana Territory. In the summer of 1862, a prospector named John White and his small group of miners were traveling through a remote valley carved by cold mountain rivers. They were tired, hungry, and almost out of supplies. They weren't expecting a miracle. But at Grasshopper Creek, White bent down, scooped a handful of gravel from the water, and saw flashes of gold. Not dust, not flakes, but coarse, heavy gold. The kind that meant one thing: a major strike. News spread like wildfire, carried by rumors, campfire talk, and the desperate hopes of men who'd been chasing fortune across the frontier. Within weeks, thousands of prospectors poured into the valley. Tents and crude cabins filled the landscape. Storefronts popped up almost overnight. Stage lines added new routes. Blacksmiths, saloon keepers, gamblers, and opportunists arrived in waves. Bannack was born, a raw, noisy, chaotic mining camp carved from nothing but ambition and the promise of sudden wealth. The creek beds rang with the sound of shovels and pans. Men worked long hours covered in mud, frozen by the mountain winds, driven by one thing: the belief that the next handful of gravel might change their lives. Within months, Bannack had a post office, several saloons, a hotel, dozens of businesses, and the beginnings of real streets. But with gold came danger. There were no real laws, no established government, no reliable protection, just thousands of strangers competing for wealth in an isolated valley. Arguments turned into fistfights. Fistfights turned into shootings. Stagecoaches carrying gold dust became targets for robbers. Bannack had all the ingredients of a boomtown and all the problems of the lawless frontier. So when a well-spoken, confident, charming man arrived in town and offered his services as sheriff, the citizens of Bannack welcomed him with relief. His name was Henry Plummer, and they believed he would bring order to the chaos. They had no idea what they were inviting into power: the sheriff with a dark secret. When Henry Plummer arrived in Bannack in late 1862, he didn't look like an outlaw. He dressed well. He spoke politely. He carried himself with confidence and charm, a rare quality in a rough frontier town. Most importantly, he had experience. Plummer had been a lawman before. He'd worn a badge. He knew how to speak to people, how to ease tensions, how to create the impression of authority and safety. Bannack, desperate for order, welcomed him with open arms. And in early 1863, Plummer was elected sheriff of Bannack. For the first time, it seemed the town had a protector, But behind the badge was a man with a far darker past. Because Plummer wasn't just familiar with criminals. He had been one. Before arriving in Bannack, he'd been convicted of second-degree murder in California. He'd lived with outlaws. He'd run with gamblers and thieves. He'd been involved with violent disputes, questionable alliances, and sudden disappearances. Some believed he was a reformed man. Others whispered that he was simply running from his past. But none of them knew the truth. Plummer wasn't just hiding from his old life. He was planning to rebuild it. The birth of a gang. Not long after taking office, robberies around Bannack became disturbingly frequent. Stagecoaches carrying gold dust were ambushed. Travelers vanished on remote trails. Merchants were held at gunpoint. Wagons full of supplies disappeared into the night. The crimes were fast, coordinated, and strangely precise, as if the robbers always knew the perfect time and place to strike. People began whispering about a mysterious group, the Innocents, a name that sounded harmless, but represented a ruthless gang of thieves and killers. And the terrifying part? They were everywhere. The gang included miners, ranchers, saloon workers, stable hands, men who seemed ordinary, but who answered to a secret leader. A leader who controlled information. A leader who knew when shipments were leaving. A leader who always stayed one step ahead of the law. A leader with a badge. Because Henry Plummer wasn't fighting the gang. He was running it. Using his position as sheriff, Plummer had built one of the most efficient outlaw networks in the West. He knew which routes were safe. He knew who carried gold. He knew when to strike and when to disappear. Under his control, Bannack became a town ruled by fear. People stopped traveling at night. Stagecoaches hired extra guards. Residents whispered behind closed doors. Suspicion grew in every direction. And yet, the sheriff who promised protection was the very man orchestrating their terror. Bannack had unknowingly placed its fate in the hands of the worst possible person. But the truth does not stay buried forever. The reign of fear, Bannack under the Innocents. As months passed, Bannack entered one of the darkest periods in its history. Fear settled over the town like a winter storm, silent, cold, and suffocating. Robberies became routine. Bodies began appearing along lonely trails. Travelers vanished without a trace. Merchants carrying gold dust walked with their hands on their pistols. People whispered that the frontier had never seen a gang so bold and so invisible. No one knew who to trust. Miners accused one another. Strangers were watched closely. Armed escorts became common for even short trips. Stagecoaches that once carried excitement and mail now carried dread. Drivers would scan the hills nervously, knowing that ambushes happened with unsettling precision. But the most terrifying part was this. Every victim believed the sheriff was their defender. Henry Plummer maintained his polished image. He attended social gatherings. He shook hands in the street. He comforted grieving families and promised justice. He even formed small patrols. Patrols he used to redirect suspicion and mislead investigators. Meanwhile, his gang, the Innocents, grew stronger. The Innocents' method. Their robberies were coordinated with military precision. Scouts positioned on ridges. Masked riders blocking escape routes. Gunmen taking positions in ravines. Perfect timing for stagecoach attacks. Victims tied and left, sometimes alive, sometimes not. Some witnesses survived, breathless and shaking, to report the same strange detail. The gang always knew too much. They knew who carried gold. They knew when shipments were delayed. They knew the habits of every merchant and miner. Only someone with insider knowledge could provide such intelligence. Still, many townspeople refused to believe the sheriff was involved. How could Bannack's elected lawmen lead such brutality? But others began to notice signs. Whispers behind buildings. Mysterious nighttime visitors. Plummer disappearing for hours with no explanation. Men loyal to him suddenly growing wealthy without mining a single ounce of gold. And then came the event that changed everything. The breaking point. A well-known explorer named Nicholas Thibault was traveling through the region. He was cautious, armed, and not easily intimidated. Yet he vanished. When his body was found, robbed and shot, word spread like wildfire. This wasn't random. This wasn't opportunistic. This was Bannack's breaking point. The townspeople realized the truth. They were not living beside a criminal gang. They were living under it. And the man they trusted with the badge was the man orchestrating their terror. Something had to be done. And in the rugged mountains of Montana, far beyond the reach of federal law, there was only one force capable of stopping Plummer: the Vigilantes. The Vigilantes Rise. Justice comes to Bannack. By early 1864, Bannack had reached its breaking point. Fear was no longer an undercurrent. It was the air people breathed. Travelers avoided the roads. Miners walked in groups. Merchants slept with rifles beside their beds. Whispers filled the saloons. Who's next? Who can we trust? When will it end? And finally, a group of men realized that if the law could not be trusted, the community had only one option: to become the law themselves. They called themselves the Vigilance Committee. Not outlaws, not criminals, but ordinary men, merchants, miners, ranchers, pushed to the edge by months of terror. They operated in secrecy, gathering evidence, tracking suspicious movements, and sharing every detail they could uncover. And slowly, a horrifying pattern emerged. Names, faces, routes, codes, all pointing to one man at the center: Sheriff Henry Plummer. The evidence was overwhelming. Gang members confessed under pressure. Maps and robbery plans were connected to Plummer's patrol routes. Outlaws turned on each other. Witnesses recounted Plummer giving suspicious orders. Survivors reported hearing gang members refer to the boss. And some gang members claimed outright, "Plummer is the chief." Whether every detail was true or exaggerated, one thing became undeniable: Bannack believed it, and belief was enough. The night riders, armed and masked, the vigilantes began making arrests. One by one, suspected members of the Innocents were captured, interrogated, and executed. Trees along the frontier trail became silent markers of justice. Stark, grim reminders that the town had finally fought back. The speed of the arrests shocked Bannack. Names long whispered in fear were now shouted openly. People who had looked harmless were revealed as violent thieves. And the Innocents began to collapse under the weight of panic and betrayal. Many gang members begged for mercy, offering confessions in exchange for their lives. Some cried. Some blamed Plummer directly. Some cursed him with their final breath. But the vigilantes had no intention of stopping. They believed the future of Bannack depended on eliminating the source of terror completely. And that source, they concluded, was a sheriff. The sheriff's last night. On January 10th, 1864, the vigilantes surrounded the Bannack jail. Henry Plummer was inside. He protested his innocence. He demanded a trial. He insisted he had been framed. He begged for time to send for witnesses who could prove his character. But the vigilantes had already made their decision. They dragged Plummer outside into the cold mountain night. A rope hung from the unfinished gallows he himself had ordered built. Witnesses said he remained calm. Others said he broke down. Some claimed he asked only for his body to be treated with respect. The vigilantes did not wait long. Under the pale winter moon, before a crowd of settlers and miners, Henry Plummer, sheriff, leader, outlaw, was hanged. Silence fell over Bannack. And just like that, the reign of terror ended. But the story of Bannack was far from over, because a town shaped by gold and ruled by fear was about to face the final chapter of its rapid rise and inevitable fall. The fall of Bannack when the gold ran out. With Henry Plummer gone and the Innocents disbanded, Bannack finally had what it had lacked for years: peace. For the first time, travelers could move without fear. Merchants reopened their doors. Miners worked without looking over their shoulders. Families breathed easier. But the silence that followed the vigilante hangings revealed an uncomfortable truth. Bannack's greatest enemy had never been Plummer. It was time, and time was running out. The gold begins to fade. Gold brought Bannack to life in 1862. But by the mid-1860s, the richest deposits along Grasshopper Creek had already been worked over. The easy gold, the surface gold, disappeared first. Prospectors panned slower. Returns dropped. Miners searched deeper, risking collapses, flooding, and long, exhausting days. Gradually, the energy that once fueled Bannack began to fade. New discoveries elsewhere. Virginia City, Alder Gulch, Helena, pulled thousands away. Entire camps moved east, chasing fresher strikes. Bannack, once the capital of Montana Territory, began to feel empty. The capital moves away. In 1865, with Bannack shrinking and Virginia City booming, the territorial government made a fateful decision. Montana's capital would move to Virginia City. This was a death blow. Government officials left. Businesses followed. Courts relocated. Influence, money, and opportunity drifted elsewhere. Bannack was still alive, but now it was fading into the shadows of history. A town slowly empties. By the 1870s, Bannack was a shell of its former self. Buildings stood vacant. Saloons closed. Farms struggled in the harsh climate. A few families stayed, hopeful, stubborn, loyal to the place they had carved out of the frontier. Some miners continued to work smaller claims, pulling modest amounts of gold from the earth. But Bannack was no longer a booming gold town. It was a quiet, tired settlement watching the world move on without it. The final years. The school stayed open until the 1950s. A handful of residents held on. Children played on the same streets where gunmen once walked. Life continued, but only just barely. Then, finally, the last families moved away. The post office closed. The buildings were abandoned. Silence returned to Grasshopper Creek. Bannack, the first seat of government in Montana Territory, the gold town that sparked a frontier rush. The community, terrorized by an outlaw sheriff, became what it is today, a ghost town. But unlike many others, Bannack did not vanish completely. Its dry climate preserved the wooden structures. Its isolation protected its history. And its story of gold, fear, justice, and decline remained intact. Today, over 60 weathered buildings still stand, frozen in time and whispering the truth of a town that lived fast, burned bright, and disappeared as quickly as it rose.